Hello, my friends. It is wonderful to have you here with me today. Find a comfortable place to sit. Relax. And let's spend a little time together. Today, I want to tell you the story of a man whose life seemed impossible. Imagine being taken away from your family. Imagine losing your freedom. Imagine spending not 1 year, not 5 years, but 27 years behind prison walls. Most people would leave prison feeling angry, bitter, or defeated, but this man was different. When he finally walked out of prison, he did not seek revenge. He did not call for violence. Instead, he helped unite a divided nation and eventually became its president. His name was Nelson Mandela. Today, Nelson Mandela is remembered as one of the most respected leaders in modern history. His face is recognized around the world. Streets, schools, and public buildings carry his name. Millions of people admire him for his courage, patience, and commitment to justice. But his journey was far from easy. Before he became a global symbol of peace, he lived through discrimination, conflict, imprisonment, and tremendous personal sacrifice. There were moments when his future seemed hopeless. There were times when many believed he would never be free again, yet somehow he endured. His story is not only about politics, it is a story about resilience. It is a story about hope. It is a story about the power of forgiveness and the strength of the human spirit. Tonight, we will travel to South Africa and follow the extraordinary journey of a young boy who would grow up to change the course of his nation and inspire the entire world. So sit back, relax, and let the story begin. Nelson Mandela was born on July 18, 1918, in a small village called Mevezo in South Africa. At the time, few people could have imagined that this young boy would one day become one of the most influential figures in modern history. Mandela was born into the Thembu royal family, a branch of the Xhosa people. Although his family held traditional leadership roles within their community, they did not live a life of great wealth. Like many children growing up in rural South Africa, Mandela spent much of his early life surrounded by rolling hills, open fields, and strong community traditions. As a child, he listened carefully to stories told by village elders. Many of these stories spoke of African leaders, courage, dignity, and the struggle to protect their people. Without realizing it, these early lessons would shape the values that guided him throughout his life. When Mandela was still young, his father passed away. This loss changed the course of his childhood. He was taken under the care of a local regent, a respected leader who introduced him to a wider world of politics, leadership, and public responsibility. At school, Mandela received an English education, something that was becoming increasingly important under British influence in South Africa. It was there that he received the name Nelson, a common practice in colonial schools at the time. As Mandela grew older, he became increasingly aware of the inequalities surrounding him. South Africa was a deeply divided society. Opportunities available to white citizens were often denied to black South Africans. Education, employment, political participation, and even daily life were shaped by racial discrimination. These divisions would eventually become part of a system known as apartheid. Under apartheid, people were separated by race through laws that controlled where they could live, work, travel, and study. The system granted power and privilege to the white minority, while restricting the rights of millions of black South Africans. As a young man, Mandela witnessed these injustices firsthand. He saw talented people denied opportunities. He saw communities treated unfairly, He saw how deeply discrimination affected everyday life. The more he learned about the world around him, the more difficult it became to ignore what was happening, and before long, Nelson Mandela would make a decision that would change the rest of his life. As Nelson Mandela entered adulthood, he became increasingly determined to challenge the system that shaped life in South Africa. He believed that every person, regardless of race, deserved dignity, opportunity, and equal treatment under the law. In the 1940s, Mandela moved to Johannesburg, one of the largest cities in South Africa. The city exposed him to a very different reality from the rural communities where he had grown up. There, he saw the effects of racial discrimination on a much larger scale. Black South Africans often faced severe restrictions in nearly every aspect of life. They had limited political rights. Many were forced to live in designated areas. Access to quality education, employment, and public services was often unequal. The system was designed to maintain the power of the white minority government. While studying law, Mandela met people who shared his concerns about injustice. He became involved with the African National Congress, commonly known as the ANC. The organization sought to achieve equal rights and challenge discriminatory policies. Through political action, Mandela quickly emerged as a passionate and energetic leader. He helped organize campaigns, meetings, and protests aimed at drawing attention to the realities faced by millions of South Africans. He believed that change was possible if enough people worked together. At first, many of these efforts focused on peaceful resistance, demonstrations, petitions, and acts of civil disobedience were used to challenge unfair laws. Mandela hoped that public pressure could convince the government to reform the system. However, the government responded with increasing force. Demonstrations were restricted, activists were monitored, political leaders faced arrests and harassment. As tensions grew, many people began to lose faith that peaceful methods alone would bring meaningful change. Mandela found himself facing difficult choices. He remained committed to justice, but he also saw that the government showed little willingness to listen to those demanding equality. The conflict between the apartheid government and its opponents continued to escalate. What had begun as a political struggle was becoming one of the most important battles for human rights in the 20th century. And soon, the government would decide that Nelson Mandela had become too dangerous to ignore. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, South Africa had become increasingly divided. The apartheid government was determined to maintain its control. While growing numbers of people demanded equality and political rights, Nelson Mandela had become one of the most visible leaders of the resistance movement. His speeches, activism, and growing influence attracted attention throughout the country. To supporters, he represented hope. To the government, he represented a threat. Authorities began closely monitoring his activities. Meetings were disrupted. Political organizations faced restrictions. Activists were arrested and questioned. The government wanted to silence those who challenged apartheid. Despite these pressures, Mandela continued his work. As peaceful protests were repeatedly met with force, frustration spread throughout the resistance movement. Many activists felt that traditional methods were no longer producing results. The government appeared unwilling to negotiate or reform the system. In response, Mandela became involved in creating a new strategy aimed at increasing pressure on the government. The goal was to target infrastructure and symbols of state power while avoiding loss of human life whenever possible. Mandela believed that the situation had reached a point where stronger action was necessary. The government reacted swiftly. Security forces launched widespread operations against opposition groups. activists were arrested across the country. Mandela himself went into hiding for a period of time, moving secretly between locations. While continuing to organize resistance efforts, the media began referring to him as the Black Pimpernel because of his ability to avoid capture. For months, he successfully stayed ahead of the authorities, but eventually, his luck ran out. In 1962, Mandela was arrested and placed on trial. The government accused him of various political offenses. What followed would become one of the most famous legal cases in modern history. During the trial, Mandela delivered a powerful statement that would echo around the world. He spoke about democracy, equality, and the vision of a society where all people could live together with equal opportunities. Then he made a declaration that stunned many who heard it. He said that the ideal of a free and democratic society was something he hoped to achieve and something he was prepared to die for. The government reached its decision. Nelson Mandela was sentenced to life imprisonment. For many people, it seemed that his story was over. In reality, the most extraordinary chapter of his life was only beginning. When Nelson Mandela arrived in prison, he was 44 years old. Few people could have imagined that he would not be free again for another 27 years. He was sent to Robben Island, a remote prison located off the coast of Cape Town, surrounded by cold ocean waters. The island was designed to isolate prisoners from the outside world. Escape was almost impossible. Life there was harsh. Mandela and other political prisoners lived in small cells with very few possessions. His cell contained little more than a bed mat, a blanket, and a bucket. The room was so small that there was barely enough space to move around comfortably. Each day followed a strict routine. Prisoners woke early, performed physical labor, and spent long hours working in a limestone quarry. The work was exhausting. The bright reflection from the white stone often damaged prisoners' eyesight. Including Mandela's, communication with family members was extremely limited. Letters were heavily censored. Visits were rare and closely monitored. Sometimes months passed before prisoners received news from loved ones. The government hoped prison would break Mandela's spirit. Instead, something remarkable happened. Mandela refused to allow his circumstances to define him. He continued reading, studying, and learning whenever possible. He encouraged fellow prisoners to educate themselves and support one another. Over time, Robben Island became known among inmates as a kind of university where ideas, knowledge, and political discussions continued. Despite the prison walls, years turned into decades. The world outside changed dramatically. Governments rose and fell. Technology advanced. Entire generations grew up, yet Mandela remained behind bars. As time passed, his name became known far beyond South Africa. Around the world, people began learning about the prisoner who had sacrificed his freedom in the struggle against apartheid. Activists, students, religious leaders, and politicians increasingly called for his release. The government offered Mandela opportunities to leave prison under certain conditions. Each time, he refused. He would not accept freedom for himself while millions of South Africans remained without freedom. His determination inspired people across the globe. What the authorities had intended as a life sentence was gradually transforming Mandela into an international symbol of resistance, dignity, and hope. And while he remained imprisoned, pressure on the South African government continued to grow stronger with every passing year. As the years passed, Nelson Mandela remained behind prison walls, but his influence continued to grow. What began as a struggle within South Africa was becoming an international movement. Around the world, people learned about apartheid and the harsh realities faced by millions of Black South Africans. Newspapers published stories about racial segregation. Universities organized protests. Religious leaders spoke out against injustice. Governments began facing pressure from their own citizens to take action. The call was simple: free Nelson Mandela. Those 3 words spread across continents. Students marched through city streets. Activists organized campaigns. Musicians performed at concerts dedicated to the anti-apartheid movement. Posters carrying Mandela's image appeared in countries thousands of miles from South Africa. For many people, Mandela had become more than a political prisoner. He had become a symbol of resistance against oppression, a symbol of dignity in the face of suffering, a symbol of hope that change was possible. The South African government found itself under increasing pressure. Some countries imposed economic sanctions, others limited trade and diplomatic cooperation. International criticism grew stronger each year. Meanwhile, South Africa itself was changing. Protests became more frequent. Communities demanded reform. The cost of maintaining apartheid continued to rise. Political tensions increased, and many leaders began realizing that the existing system could not continue forever. Inside prison, Mandela followed these developments carefully. Whenever information reached him, although isolated from much of the world, he understood that something important was happening. The balance was shifting. The government that once seemed unshakable was facing challenges from both inside and outside the country. Negotiations that had once seemed impossible were slowly becoming necessary. After decades of imprisonment, a question was beginning to emerge. Could Nelson Mandela finally be released? For years, the answer had been no. But now, for the first time in a generation, the possibility of freedom no longer seemed impossible. And soon, one of the most famous prison doors in modern history would finally open. By the end of the 1980s, South Africa stood at a crossroads. The apartheid system was under enormous pressure. International sanctions were hurting the economy. Political unrest continued to grow around the world. Governments, activists, and ordinary citizens were demanding change. The old system was becoming impossible to sustain inside prison. Nelson Mandela had now spent more than 2 decades behind bars. He had entered prison as a young activist. He was now an older man whose name had become known across the globe. Behind the scenes, secret discussions began taking place between Mandela and government officials. Both sides understood that South Africa faced a dangerous future if no solution could be found. Violence was increasing. Tensions were rising. The country seemed to be moving toward a crisis. Then, in February 1990, history changed. South African President F.W. de Klerk announced that Nelson Mandela would be released from prison. The news spread rapidly across the world. Television stations interrupted their regular broadcasts. Newspapers rushed to print special editions. Millions waited to witness a moment many had believed would never happen. After 27 years in prison, Nelson Mandela was finally free. On February 11, 1990, he walked through the prison gates, holding the hand of his wife, Winnie Mandela. Cameras captured every moment. Crowds cheered. Supporters celebrated. Around the world, people watched with amazement. The image quickly became one of the most famous photographs of the 20th century. What made the moment so powerful was not simply that Mandela had been released. It was the way he emerged. Many expected anger. Many expected bitterness. Many expected revenge. Instead, Mandela spoke about peace, reconciliation, and building a better future together. He understood that South Africa faced a choice. The nation could continue down a path of conflict and division, or it could attempt something far more difficult. It could try to heal, For Mandela, freedom was never only about walking out of prison. It was about creating a country where all people could live with equal rights and dignity. The struggle was not over. In many ways, the most challenging part of his journey was only beginning, because now, the man who had spent 27 years as a prisoner would have to help lead an entire nation into a new future. After his release from prison, Nelson Mandela faced an enormous challenge. South Africa remained deeply divided. Decades of apartheid had created distrust, anger, and fear. Many people worried that the country could fall into widespread violence. Others feared that peaceful change would be impossible. Mandela knew that freedom alone was not enough. The nation needed a new future. Over the next several years, Mandela worked with political leaders from different backgrounds to negotiate the end of apartheid. The process was difficult. There were disagreements, setbacks, and moments when progress seemed uncertain. Yet Mandela remained committed to finding a peaceful solution. His leadership helped build trust during one of the most sensitive periods in South African history. Then came a historic moment. In 1994, South Africa held its first democratic national election, in which citizens of all races could vote. For millions of people, it was the first time they had ever been allowed to participate fully in choosing their government. Long lines formed outside polling stations across the country. People waited for hours. Many were willing to wait all day. They understood that they were witnessing history. When the results were announced, Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress won the election. At the age of 75, Nelson Mandela became the first black president of South Africa. The moment carried enormous symbolic power. The man who had spent 27 years in prison was now leading the nation that had once imprisoned him. For many observers around the world, it seemed almost impossible. Yet Mandela understood that becoming president was not the final victory. Winning an election was easier than healing a divided society. South Africa still faced poverty, inequality, and deep social wounds left by decades of apartheid. Mandela's greatest test was still ahead. The world expected him to punish his former enemies. Instead, he would choose a path that surprised nearly everyone, a path built on forgiveness rather than revenge. Many leaders throughout history have gained power. After years of struggle, few have faced a choice as difficult as Nelson Mandela's. After spending 27 years in prison, he had every reason to feel anger. He had lost precious years with his family. He had lived under harsh conditions. He had witnessed injustice on a scale few people could imagine. Many of his supporters expected revenge. Some believed that those who had enforced apartheid should suffer the same pain they had inflicted on others. But Mandela saw things differently. He understood that revenge might satisfy emotions in the short term, but it would not build a stable future. South Africa remained home to millions of people from different racial and cultural backgrounds. If the country descended into retaliation and violence, everyone would lose. Mandela often spoke about the importance of reconciliation. He believed that former enemies had to find a way to live together. This did not mean forgetting the past. It did not mean pretending that injustice had never happened. Instead, it meant acknowledging painful truths while choosing a different path forward. One of the most important steps was the creation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The commission allowed victims to share their experiences and gave perpetrators an opportunity to confess their actions publicly. The goal was not simply punishment. The goal was healing. The process was imperfect and often emotional. Many stories were heartbreaking. Families finally learned what had happened to loved ones. Communities confronted painful memories that had been hidden for years. Yet the commission helped South Africa avoid the large-scale violence that many people had feared. Mandela also used symbolic gestures to promote unity. He reached out to groups that had once opposed him. He met with former political enemies. He encouraged South Africans to see themselves as part of one nation rather than separate communities divided by race. Perhaps the most famous example came during the 1995 Rugby World Cup. Rugby had long been associated with white South Africans, and many expected Mandela to distance himself from the sport. Instead, he publicly supported the national team. When South Africa won the tournament, Mandela appeared wearing the team's jersey and congratulated the players. The moment became a powerful symbol of national unity through actions like these. Mandela showed the world that leadership is not only about winning power, it is about choosing what to do with that power once it is in your hands. And because of that choice, Nelson Mandela's influence would extend far beyond South Africa. As Nelson Mandela's presidency came to an end, many people wondered how history would remember him. The answer became clear very quickly. Mandela was no longer viewed only as a South African leader. He had become a global symbol of courage, resilience, and human dignity. His story inspired people far beyond the borders of his own country. What made Mandela remarkable was not simply that he fought against injustice. Many people have done that. What made him extraordinary was the way he responded. After suffering injustice himself, he spent 27 years in prison. He lost some of the most important years of his life. He endured isolation, hardship, and uncertainty. Yet when freedom finally arrived, he chose reconciliation over revenge. That decision changed the course of South African history around the world. Mandela became a symbol of hope for people facing discrimination, oppression, and conflict. His speeches were studied. His leadership was admired. His example demonstrated that strength is not always measured through force. Sometimes, the greatest strength comes from patience, self-control, and forgiveness. In 1993, Mandela received the Nobel Peace Prize alongside F.W. de Klerk for their efforts to peacefully end apartheid and build a democratic South Africa. The award recognized not only a political achievement, but also a remarkable act of leadership during a period when violence could easily have consumed the nation. Even after leaving office, Mandela continued supporting humanitarian causes, education, healthcare, and social justice. He remained respected by leaders from every part of the world. When Nelson Mandela passed away on December 5, 2013, tributes came from across the globe. Presidents, prime ministers, religious leaders, and ordinary citizens all honored his memory. Millions reflected on the extraordinary journey of a man who had transformed both himself and his nation. Today, Mandela's legacy continues to endure. His story reminds us that difficult circumstances do not define our future. His life reminds us that courage often requires sacrifice, and perhaps most importantly, his example teaches us that forgiveness can sometimes achieve what anger never could. From a small village in South Africa to the world stage, Nelson Mandela's journey remains one of the most powerful stories of the modern era. A prisoner, Apartheid, a symbol of hope, and a man whose legacy continues to inspire generations around the world. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the life of Nelson Mandela. Until next time, take care of yourself, keep learning, and never underestimate the power of courage, compassion, and hope.